Hello, and thank you for joining us tonight for the first of 3 Culture Meets Policy conversations in conjunction with the exhibition Howardena Pindell, Rope, Fire, Water, curated by Adise Wilford and now on view at the Shed through the spring. My name is Solana Chehtman. I'm the director of civic programs at the Shed. I am a Latina woman with short salt and pepper hair in a blue short sleeve dress and very red lips, coming to you from my living room, surrounded by some art and some plants. Tonight, we are providing live captioning that you can turn on by clicking on the CC button on the bottom right side of your Zoom screen, and American Sign Language interpretation that should be visible throughout the conversation. And we'll be asking all participants to share visual descriptions when appropriate. At any point, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share them through the Q&A button, also on the bottom right of your screen. And we'll hear more from our moderator, but at the end, we'll have space for your questions. Over her nearly 60-year career, Howardena Pindell has been a trailblazing artist, curator, and activist, and her current exhibition at the Shed is a testament to her incredible talent and her tireless commitment to both denounce and fight racial violence in our country, as well as meditate on and celebrate beauty and joy. Although we had been working on the exhibition and its contextualization for a few years, they couldn't feel more timely and relevant in this moment after a global pandemic and a broken state and government put a magnifying glass to the increasing inequalities in our society, particularly affecting Black Americans and BIPOC communities broadly. With the complete conviction that culture can affect social and policy change and vice versa, and deeply inspired by Michelle Alexander's op-ed and call to action last year, America, This Is Your Chance, we created this series of conversations that will center on our deeply and intentionally unfair economic system tonight, the over-policing and under-protecting of our communities on February 18th, and our broken democratic system that, giving yesterday's moving inauguration, we can only say is still barely surviving in spite of it all on March 18th. I invite you to check out our website, theshed.org, and come back for them, as well as for our Pindell's Legacy conversations with curators, activists, and educators coming up, as well as to walk our city with Fighting Dark, our audio tour created by Kama Ware's Black Gotham Experience, connecting Pindell's exhibition with the history of racial violence in New York City. I'd like to thank the Ford Foundation and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs for their generous support of this commission and for our public programs. I also want to thank the Howard Gilman Foundation for providing the Zoom platform that we will be using for this evening's conversation. And I want, of course, to thank the amazing speakers that we will hear from in a minute. And I want to thank very particularly our co-presenter for this series, Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, and introduce Zenzele Cooper, their program manager, to share a few words and welcome you all.
Thank you, Solana. Revolutionary greetings, everyone. How y'all feeling out there? I suspect we're all feeling a teensy bit better after yesterday's momentous occasion. Breathing a sigh of relief. I hope you're healthy and in good spirits. I'm Zenzele Cooper, the program manager at Weeksville Heritage Center, a historic house museum, and a cultural site in central Brooklyn dedicated to the preservation of the historic Hunter Fly Road houses and to the history of Weeksville, one of the earliest free Black communities in the United States of America, founded in 1838. Please visit weeksvillesociety.org to stay in reach. I just want to quickly give thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Thank you to Solana and to the Shed for extending the invitation to Weeksville to be a co-presenter for these very important conversations about culture and policy in connection with the very important and timely exhibition Rope, Fire, Water by our dear sister and the giant Howardena Pindell. Howardena, if you're out there, we love you. We thank you for your courage and tremendous contributions to the culture, and you have a home at Weeksville. And lastly, I just want to give thanks to the amazing women on the panel tonight for sharing your brilliance with us and for helping us to continue the work of making this country and the world a more just and equitable one. So peace, y'all. Thank you.
Thank you, Zenzele. And as you know, we're such big fans and loved partnering with you on this. So thank you once again. Finally, and I don't want to take any more time from our wonderful speakers, I want to now introduce tonight's moderator, my colleague and friend, and someone that I deeply admire, Prerana Reddy, former director of programs at A Blade of Grass and the Queen's Museum, who will introduce our wonderful speakers and begin the conversation. Thank you all, and thank you, Prerana.
Thank you, Solana, for the honor of being able to moderate this series of conversations. Cultural work is being done not just by artists, but by everyone in their own communities, by folks in community-based organizations, by folks doing policy work, as we shall see today. And I want to get right into it because we have 4 amazing speakers in just an hour. And let you know a little bit about the format for today. So I'm going to present a couple of questions to each of the panelists one-on-one in turn. And then we're going to have a group conversation amongst all the panelists. Please use the Q&A function to put your questions in at any time as they come up for you as people are speaking. I'm going to be looking through that and trying to incorporate that in that conversation at the end. Apologies in advance that I may not get to all of them, but I'll do my best. And hopefully we can also have the panelists jump in and ask each other's questions as well. One thing before I start introducing our first speaker is that I may be referencing the work of the organizations that they work for or formerly work for, but I'm really addressing these questions to the panelists as individuals, and the answers that they provide are to be understood as their personal opinions and not the positions of the organizations that they work for. So with that, I'm going to jump right in with our first speaker. Barika X Williams is the Executive Director of the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, a leading nonprofit focused on creating housing and economic justice for all New Yorkers. Barika, welcome. So part of Rope, Fire, Water strategy is to present the data around anti-Black violence plainly, to list the history of atrocities for them to speak for themselves. If you could pick 2, and I know that's hard because there are many, housing and policy planning, planning and housing policy decisions in New York City that most harmed Black people in the past 50 years, what would they be? What were the consequences in terms of reinforcing anti-Blackness? And what violences were committed that should be more broadly known outside of the field?
So thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? And everybody at the Shed for having me. I think you're absolutely right that it's hard to choose 2. And I think the important piece for folks to understand is how foundational settler colonialism, slavery, institutional racism, and systemic oppression and disenfranchisement is in land use and in planning and in policy, right? Like the exclusion of property and ownership is really fundamental to our system of exclusion and of oppression. And so it's difficult to pick 2, but I think the 2 that I would lift up in this conversation are redlining and exclusionary zoning. And the consequences of them we continue to live with today. They have been foundational and instrumental in shaping our neighborhoods and who has access to what. And really which Walis will show is the maps that were created around redlining are the blueprints of neighborhoods as we understand them today, and are the blueprints of neighborhoods that continue to be segregated, oppressed, repressed to this day, that who continue to struggle for access and for equity and for justice day in and day out. And then I think the other piece is really understanding the role that exclusionary zoning has played for decades. And that's tied, of course, to redlining, but continues to manifest as certain neighborhoods deemed their area safe. Also, not just neighborhoods, but endorsed and facilitated by the city and the state and federal government for generations, which manifests itself in a way that we see now of a Black home ownership rate that has been pretty much static at 25% for years. And we continue to see where Black tenants and especially POC tenants continue to pay an extraordinary amount of 35% of their income to rent, and that eats up their ability to go to put to things like healthcare and education and culture and art, right? And this is how we continue to repeat this violent cycle year after year, and it's regenerative. Like we just continue to build and compound on what we've done before.
Yeah, and that connects me to my next question, which is that I'm inspired by the dynamic in Pindell's work that balances the kind of dark and very direct work that confronts racism with these beautiful, radiant, abstract compositions that allow for joy and respite and beauty. And I'm wondering, in terms of housing, you know, we're at such a struggle to even demand adequate and safe housing, but there's more than that. What kinds of amenities and services should we and can we be providing that also, you know, privilege rest, beauty, spaciousness, that's kind of foundational for healing trauma and building thriving communities and not just surviving communities.
Well, and you a perfect phrase when you said thriving communities, because one of the things that ANHD does is we run and lead and facilitate a coalition called the Thriving Communities Coalition, that is folks who come together and nonprofit organizations from across the city that are like, what we really want are thriving communities. There's a big difference between folks who build units that people live in and people who are in the business of creating homes and communities. And I think one of the things that we really have to take a moment to ask ourselves and analyze, and I think this is very much viscerally felt in so many Black neighborhoods, is that there's a difference between putting up a building, which can happen fast and maybe it looks pretty, but that's very different than the slow and deliberative process of having a conversation about what a community needs, what it wants, green space, a cultural center, a new school space, right? And to create that space for a community so that they can come together, interact, people have space to step away. Maybe we need space for people to be in silence and in quiet. And these are conversations that oftentimes we're not having with communities. We're just rushing to do the next thing. And so we've been talking a lot about what is it that a community needs as a development and as a project, as opposed to just getting units done.
And you know, since this is a conversation that is connecting policy and culture, as a Black planner and designer in a field that's often dominated by a white perspective of beauty, of what's good housing, or how people think about notions of kinship, or what public and private spaces should, you know, how they should be distinct. If folks of color and Black planners in particular were able to build communities, you know, understanding the social relationships, as you mentioned, what kinds, like how would it look different, you know, aesthetically or like in a design way?
I mean, I think it's I hate to admit it, but I think it's an incredibly difficult question to answer. In part because the planning field and the planning industry is so overwhelmingly white and so overwhelmingly white, male, and cis. Right, that is what the field is. And so I go back to this poet, Wante, who has this framing in one of his poems that does like slam poetry around white supremacy is not a shark, it's the water, right? And so asking that is like re-envision the water when our entire field, education, upbringing has been to make tweaks, right? And so I think many of us are really starting to push and say, how would we envision our own communities? How would we change that? But it is still understanding that even if you created your Black community, right, oasis island, POC island, whatever it is, that it still exists in this broader water of white supremacy, and that at some point in time, we as a neighborhood, as a community, are going to have to step and interact into that. But I think we see communities find ways to do it. Porches become public spaces, right? It looks very different. Whereas in certain communities, that's a very private thing. Why are people gathering on the porch? Why are they talking? But for Black communities, that's a place of neighborhood, right? It's you interact in your kitchen and you interact on the porch. And so I think some of this is things that we really need to push the overall planning field to confront their own racism and their own flawed lens and really think about where we're heading overall.
Thank you, Barika. I am going to now introduce Walis Johnson. She's a multidisciplinary artist and researcher whose work documents the experience and poetics of the urban landscape through oral history, ethnographic film, and performance and artist walking practices. Walis, going back to Pindell's Rope, Fire, Water, it really showcases Pindell's archivist instinct, the finding of resonant documents and images that tell a history that's almost hidden in plain sight. And your Red Line Archive project similarly collects and shows both public and private archival material about the history of how Black communities have been excluded from home ownership and financial tools, as Barika mentioned, from the 30s through the 60s, effectively cutting off the means of home ownership, hindering the economic development of neighborhoods. And that legacy is felt by so many people, not just in New York City, but throughout the country where redlining occurred. But it somehow still has failed to become common knowledge. How is it that despite so much material evidence, so many people still deny the structural and policy basis for this inequity? And how have you seen art, your art in particular, to be able to create moments of acceptance of that reality?
Thank you, Prerana. Just thanking the Shed and Zenzele and Barika for just setting up some wonderful points to this conversation that I can leap off of. Yeah, you know, part of the issue with redlining is that it's hidden in plain sight, and people don't really understand how it has impacted their lives in very, very, very specific ways. And so, and even my own project, so this is a redline map of Brooklyn. And I started this project after the death of my mother. I live in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn, which is a neighborhood that has gentrified. I won't even say it's gentrifying. It's been gentrifying over the years. And when she died, I started getting notices. In fact, I got a note right away, the first day, from somebody who wanted to buy our family home. And so the project came, the genesis of the project was from that moment where I said, well, you know, what's going on here? First of all, I was very upset, but then I started to get really curious about, like, what is this thing that's happening in my own neighborhood, and what are these maps? And so I decided to take a walk around redline maps to see for myself. And I realized at the point of the death of my mother, that this personal experience had become political, and that I was able to, through walking, look at what was hidden in plain sight and try to understand its impact on me and my family, and by extension, the rest of Black people who lived in neighborhoods like mine, who who were not fully aware of what these maps were doing and how they were impacting their lives and impacting the lives of white people who didn't know about the maps. They became public fairly recently, and you can actually go online now and see all 239 of them all around the country. And basically, they were the blueprint for how neighborhoods would be laid out and who was going to live in the most desirable areas, and where investment was going to go, and where banking mortgages were going to go. And actually, if you look at this red line map of Brooklyn, which I walked during my research for this project, I walked the perimeter of this map. You'll see that in the northern part of Brooklyn, almost all of those neighborhoods, are in fact gentrified now. So at one point they were red, which means that banks were not offering loans to people who wanted to buy homes in those areas. And now, if you think about the neighborhoods of Greenpoint, Williamsburg, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Clinton Hill, Fort Greene, all of these neighborhoods have been gentrified, and so they've flipped. And so the question is, why did they flip? And so at one time in history, poverty was created in those neighborhoods and nobody invested in them. And now suddenly they are valuable. And so, you know, one hallmark of real estate is you buy low and sell high, right? So these red areas, properties were undervalued, and now they are highly valued. So that's part of the cycle of gentrification. The other thing that I wanted to show was just sort of how the personal is always political, in my view, and how these maps really kind of can determine your future generations after they were created. So could you put up the next slide? So this is what I created. It's called the Red Line Archive, and it's a mobile archive that I take to public spaces, spaces that were being gentrified, places like Crown Heights and Bedford-Stuyvesant that are aggressively being gentrified right now. Okay, and the next slide, please. And then from that archive, which contains personal documents from my family, and also copies of the Red Line maps that were made of the different boroughs of New York, from that project, which was a project in which I dialogued with people about their experience of redlining or living in Brooklyn, I created this Red Line labyrinth, and I installed it in Brooklyn. And this was an opportunity for people to reflect on their own personal relationship to redlining and what it means to them, and how they were, through this awareness, coming to some sort of emotional acceptance, perhaps, of the experience of redlining and what it created in their lives. Next slide, please. So people walk the line, the Red Line Labyrinth, and they choose from a number of questions about their own experience of home, their own experience of freedom, citizenship, their dreams, their legacies of wealth. And then they have an opportunity to meditate on that as they walk through the labyrinth. And a lot of wonderful feedback has been generated from that, but it also offers people an opportunity to reflect and, in some cases, grieve and mourn and feel angry and come to some sort of awareness, acceptance, and perhaps action on how they are going to move forward in their lives both personally and perhaps politically.
Thank you, Walis, for sharing this powerful work with us. And, you know, what you were just saying about how going through this process, meditating, having this structure in which to guide you on this meditation really helps audience, you know, or the visitor, the person who's experiencing this, figure out how trauma sometimes gets hidden deep inside and needs this type of experience to actually be released and addressed. Your work kind of reminds me of the social psychologist Mindy Foley Love, who described the type of traumatic stress reaction that happens when neighborhoods get displaced as a kind of post-traumatic stress called root shock. And I think what you've shown and what your work has shown is that the ripple effects of that, even, you know, 30, 40, 50 years, you know, after that policy might have been repealed, still continues to impact, you know, entire communities. And I really thank you for this work. And we'll come back to you at the end when we come back in dialogue. At this point, I'd like to introduce Betsy MacLean, who's the executive director of Hester Street, where she and her team devote their time to urban planning, design, and development expertise in support of community-led change. Betsy, like Walis's work, Hester Street addresses the, you know, ongoing legacy of redlining and other racist policies on neighborhoods, but from a land use and planning process and sometimes policy angle. Some examples from Hester Street's work includes the New York City Fair Housing Assessment, the People's Data Warehouse, and your community land trust work. And you talk a lot about radically reimagining the systems that shape our cities and our lives. Can you talk about what that means to you and how your work and Hester Street's work is difficult from a kind of typical community engagement process that might be stewarded by the city or the city planning department or other social impact design firms?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Prerana. Thanks just kind of first to like all the folks on the panel. I'm super honored to share this space with you, to the Shed for inviting me. And I know there's some comrades out there in the audience. So like, hi, happy to share the space tonight. Wish we could all be together. Yeah, I mean, so I'll talk maybe a little bit about like, you know, I really moved by both what kind of Barika said and what Walis said about kind of the, you know, kind of the personal motivation that kind of brings us all to this work. You know, my neighborhood where I live, where I'm raising my children, is like kind of the constant inspiration for my work, for our work at Hester Street, because it both exemplifies kind of the very best of community, of neighbors working together, looking out for each other, taking care of each other, especially in this last really horrible, challenging year, and also the very worst of neighborhoods, the worst of the kind of racist systems that not only shape neighborhoods, continue to shape and distort neighborhoods, and do violence to the people who live in them. So, you know, I think what we're talking about tonight, I think, you know, the city council member in Minneapolis, this guy, Jeremiah Bay Ellison, he said, you know, the how we got here is known, you know, from redlining to urban renewal to all of the many kind of policies and practices that got us here. We know all of that stuff. And what he says is the path out is therefore knowable. And I guess I really believe that how we chart that knowable path, like how we radically rethink the neighborhoods, the cities, the country that we live in, that it's the process is almost as important as the work itself.
You know, at Hester Street, I have the great privilege of working with this remarkable team of urban planners, designers, community organizers, and developers who support, like you said, Prerana, community-led change. And we are really kind of all about radically recreating cities and confronting this kind of racist history by creating kind of deeply democratic planning and policy making that centers the knowledge, the wisdom, the experience of Black and Brown communities who've long been left out of, actively barred from the conversation. So our work, while it's kind of steeped in data and maps and kind of beautiful graphics, I would say, because beauty is so important, and also popular education and creative engagement tools, it really is fundamentally about power. And we believe that it is within process that we find the key to power. So, you know, process is not exactly the most sexy thing to kind of talk about or to try to like get money from foundations to support. You know, there's a reason why like hashtag process matters doesn't have, you know, kind of a ton of traction. And same when I talk to my pops about the work that I do, I most definitely do not lead with process. That said, at the heart of our work, of our inspiration to do this work is this drive for connection, to kind of blur the lines between government and the people, which are so kind of entrenched, thick, deep, huge walls, which is not the way, you know, to kind of move towards more of like a co-governance of governance by and for the people, to embrace this concept of, you know, kind of my favorite concept of Ubuntu, which is kind of I am because you are. South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu talks about Ubuntu a lot. He says Ubuntu is like the essence of being human. It speaks of the fact that my humanity is inextricably bound up in yours. And that is, it's so beautiful. And I wish I had come to, well, I don't know if I wish, but I didn't come to Ubuntu through Archbishop Tutu. I know about it mostly because of basketball, because of Doc Rivers and the Boston Celtics. So I often, you know, get a lot of blank stares from my colleagues when I start talking about sports. But I know some of my friends in the audience kind of feel me on this, and am heartened that I share my passion for sports with Dr. Cornel West, who says that sports are truth and beauty and excellence. So just like very
Betsy, maybe I can ask you to talk about a specific, you know, project or a neighborhood process and something that came out of that probably wouldn't have happened without your intervention, just so that we can understand how this process leads to perhaps different solutions than a traditional process would.
Sure. I mean, I think it's, you know, kind of at the heart of the process is centering communities, Black and Brown communities, immigrant communities, Native communities, ensuring that that the process is shaped by their priorities, their needs, that are defined by community members. What we kind of really talk about is that we're not looking to kind of gather feedback or get buy-in from the communities we work with, which is what traditional community engagement, when it is done at all, is what community engagement is frequently about, kind of checking boxes, but that we're actively working to kind of reimagine the relationship between government and people, to move from kind of transaction to transformation, to kind of move from you know, this kind of community engagement arc from ignored to informed to real ownership, and ownership of the process, and so therefore ownership of the policy. So I'll say, you know, in some of the work that we've done around fair housing, in the city's fair housing assessment, our work with the Department of Cultural Affairs around the cultural plan, these are all kind of citywide processes that resulted in a range of policies that were shaped directly and concretely by community members, and that community engagement was inclusive and accessible and, you know, increasingly accountable. Though I will say that is the most challenging component, I think, of community engagement.
Great. I'm going to shift from this attention and focus on process, not to also say that you build things and you work with community-based organizations as well. To help them.
Sorry, I think we're having some technical Wi-Fi difficulties, which is not rare in these times, but Prerana, you're back. So I'll pass it back to you again.
Sorry, I was about to move. Apologies for that. I was just going to say that before we move to the next speaker, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about the Immigrant Center that you're building in Queens and how that work with community-based organizations is another aspect of Hester Street's work.
Sure. Yeah, so, you know, as much as we're kind of about like radical reimagination of kind of unjust systems, we also know that to be able to kind of deliver on the promise of democracy, to kind of institutionalize all of this stuff, we're going to need some assets to make all of that possible. And in kind of our current capitalist context, owning our own land and places and organizational homes allows for, you know, a pretty gigantic degree of freedom, of independence, of protection that really then opens the door to possibility. So we work with community-based organizations to kind of leverage their deep roots in the Black, Brown, Native, and immigrant communities that they serve, as well as their decades of relationship building. So while they might not have a gigantic balance sheet with like tons of capital, they do have these like amazing relationships that we can really leverage to be able to kind of chart out the vision for a space, a home of their own, and then assemble the financing and design and construction know-how necessary to acquire vacant land and or buildings and make them their own and forever. So we're doing that with Make the Road New York in Corona and Queens, which is a remarkable project. I think especially in this time when we purchased the building was kind of at the beginning of when we purchased the land, it was at the beginning of the Trump presidency. And for, you know, a group of the New York City's largest immigrant-led group to really like kind of put a stake in the ground and say, you know, this is ours, we're here and we're not going anywhere is hugely powerful on kind of a psychic, spiritual level and a political level. But it also has like real kind of measurable impacts for the organization. It lowers their operating costs, so more money can go into programs and services. It protects them against the vagaries of a real estate market, of rapid gentrification, of shitty landlords and the threat of displacement, allowing organizations room to kind of breathe, to plan, to dream. And it also builds wealth in communities. It becomes, you know, this home that we're building for Make the Road will be an asset that they'll be able to leverage in the future and equity that they'll continue to build. So I think, you know, as much as we struggle with, you know, or totally agree with Audre Lorde when she says you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. I think we kind of embrace the complexity of our political ideology and work to deliver kind of these kinds of tangible benefits in ownership, in actual investments in assets within Black and Brown communities, while we also play this kind of long game of political transformation.
Great, thank you, Betsy. And we'll come back to you in the group conversation. Now I'm happy to introduce Kriston Alford McIntosh, who's the managing director at Hamilton Place Strategies, an analytical public affairs consulting firm. And she joined HPS from the Brookings Institution, where she served as a managing director of the Hamilton Project, which produces innovative policy proposals on how to create a more just economy that benefits more Americans. And my questions for you, Kriston, really have to do with racial wealth disparities. And we know that these disparities are large between white and Black households. And can you share the extent of those disparities for our audience, and also some of the reasons that this statistic has endured over many decades?
Absolutely. Thank you. And again, thanks to the Shed for inviting me to be part of this truly extraordinary panel today. I'd like to begin by sharing just a few brief reflections on wealth more broadly in the US. You know, wealth is most commonly acquired by inheritance that's passed down through generations. For example, in 2020, Americans were projected to inherit about $765 billion in gifts and bequests. And this excluded wealth transfers to spouses or even those supporting minor children. Wealth is so consequential because it offers a safety net that can keep a family from being derailed and falling into poverty due to economic shocks like the unexpected loss of income or debilitating health conditions. It helps families access housing in safe neighborhoods with good schools, and it allows people to take career risks or even do things like start businesses. So to your question of just how large and how persistent the racial wealth gap is in the US today, I'd note that today wealth remains highly concentrated among white Americans. For example, in 2019, the median white household held around $188,000 in wealth. This is roughly 7.8 times that of the typical Black household. You know, and it's also worth noting that the levels of average wealth, which are more likely to be heavily skewed by households with the greatest amount of wealth, those are even higher. White households reported average wealth of over $983,000, which is 6.9 times that of Black households. So again, while median wealth is going to be more reflective of the typical household, the scale of average wealth is indicative of the outsized levels of wealth that are held by the richest households. And then I just, want to close on this question and bring this back to the historical context for wealth creation and race in the United States. The Black-white wealth gap today, it's really a continuation of decades-long trends of wealth inequality. Efforts by Black Americans to build wealth can be traced back throughout American history. But as we know, these efforts were impeded in a host of ways, beginning with, 246 years of chattel slavery, followed by things like the congressional mismanagement of the Freedmen's Savings Bank back in 1874, which left over 61,000 depositors with losses of over $3 million. There was the violent massacre back in 1921 in Tulsa's Greenwood district, which was commonly referred to as the Black Wall Street back then. And then discriminatory policies throughout the 20th century, including Jim Crow and Black codes, which strictly limited opportunity in so many Southern states, as well as policies like the GI Bill, the New Deal's Fair Labor Standards Act, which exempted many domestic, agricultural, and service occupations. And of course, as we've already discussed this evening, redlining. So, I just say that wealth was taken from these communities before it ever really had the opportunity to grow. And this legacy continues to impact us today.
Another thing that I wanted to ask you about is I know some of the research that's come out about how communities have recovered after the recession in 2008, the mortgage crisis. We see that impact of how communities have bounced back is different, and that Black communities have had a harder time, in terms of that recovery, and that's another kind of moment in which this wealth gap has increased. And perhaps you can also talk about, when you add gender to that, how Black women in particular have been particularly challenged, and the policy aspects to why they've had a harder time.
Absolutely. It's indisputable that even the current COVID pandemic and the COVID recession has left Black households more vulnerable due to the wealth gap. And in a recent analysis that I co-authored with some of my former Brookings colleagues, we looked at how the Black-white wealth gap has played a huge role in the uneven and unequal economic recoveries that are so often experienced during recessions like that in 2008, and even today's. Specifically, we looked at things like how the household wealth leading up to to the pandemic diverged, the intersection between the Black-white wealth gap and the gender wealth gap, and then of course disparities within the labor market that are due to race. And so just a couple of really interesting findings that we concluded are that, during the Great Recession, for example, the decline in median wealth for Black and white households was nearly equal between the years of 2007 and 2010 at around 28 and 27% respectively. However, as white households began to gradually recover their wealth around the years 2010 through 2013 at a rate of approximately 1%, during the same period, Black household wealth continued to decline by 23%. And even in the second quarter of last year, of 2020, right around the onset of the COVID pandemic, we found that white households, who account for approximately 60% of the nation's population, held 84% of total household wealth. And meanwhile, Black households held just 4%. So what this tells us is that in the short term, renewed support is really needed to curb the economic pain that so many households without wealth are experiencing due to the COVID recession. But in the long term, we're going to have to look at much broader policies. And then just quickly to your question about the gender disparities, it's really problematic because we know that women of color, Black women, Native American women, Latinx women are so often the linchpin of their family's economic security. And so the central role of women of color, is even more pivotal going into the current COVID recession, since women, made up the majority of the workforce at just over 50%. Yet their ability to build wealth, it's been impeded both because of their race and their gender. And just a couple of really quick statistics that I think really illustrate the gravity of the economic security that's faced by Black women and other women of color, just include reminders that, women of color are often more likely to work in service sector jobs, which are typically lower wage and often lack adequate benefits. They're more likely to be the sole breadwinners in their households. We all know about the gender wage gap, but when you look at Black women, so today women overall earn around 80 cents on the dollar compared to men, but the numbers get so much worse. If you look at Black women, it's around 62% on the dollar. And that causes Black women to lose more than $800,000 a year on average over a 40-year career. And then, if they've got to step out of the workforce to care for sick children, elderly family members, they're losing income, they're losing access to things like Social Security benefits, and are sometimes forced to spend down whatever savings they might have. We're less likely to own stock. And so just collectively, we're really trapped in a vicious cycle that can impede the ability to build wealth. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think that data really puts a fine point on what we know kind of more generally. And I think underlies like how urgent it is that we don't just go back to normal, but we change things for the future. And in the past, the narrative has been, if people of color and Black folks have the same level of educational attainment, or if the wage levels, become, more regularized, that would be enough. But obviously what you're saying is, historically, the impediments to wealth building are, over generations is something that is not going to address. And so what are some of the policy recommendations that you think would do more than just, address some of these like smaller, more short-term things, but address the kind of large and multi-generational aspect, maybe perhaps like thinking of it as a reparations lens, if that's useful, that, we can start to think of and push for, in this moment in which racial inequity is something that we're grappling more head on than perhaps.
Absolutely. So yeah, I really think it's important to stress that these the situation that we found ourselves in today, it's not a predicament of lifestyle choices or poor savings. Black households aren't going to educate their way out of a centuries-long racial wealth gap, and we're not going to save our way out of it. Really, it's going to necessitate substantive and systemic changes in a range of policy issues, right? Everything from education, really big, bold reforms there, small businesses, healthcare, access to broadband, as the COVID pandemic has shown with the remote learning, both in rural areas and even urban areas too. Things like tax reform, broader place-based policies are all part of it. And certainly certainly looking at things like, studying reparations and figuring out what that would look like, baby bonds. I mean, I just think this is a time where we need to go big and bold, and if we really want to make progress. And of course, we do need to stem the pain that so many Americans in New York, here where I am in the DC region, people are really in pain and they're hurting, and those need to be addressed. But we do eventually have to think bigger and more boldly to address this gap.
And now at this point, I'd like to bring back all the panelists. So please turn your cameras back on so we can see you. And, some of the questions that have come up from the audience, I think we've addressed a lot of, but some of them have to do with narrative, folks talking about, how we talk about inequity. Is inequity or equity conversations, too difficult? Are there better ways of talking about it? Guaranteeing equality of opportunity? And what are the differences between speaking about it as an equity issue versus, other types of ways of addressing it or talking about it? We also have a very specific question around, what reparations studies have already happened, and that some of them have happened in California as recently as last year, and what can we learn from folks who've already done some work on that. So I don't know if any of you have want to jump in on either of those questions. Just jump in because I can't see everyone. No? Well, I'll let you think on that. In the meantime, one of the things that Kriston brought up is specifically about how COVID-19 has been a force that's exacerbated inequality along racial lines. And in your various fields, what do you see are the urgent priorities right now in the communities that you're working in, or what are the policy things that in your field you feel need to be advanced in the immediate term?
So I can take some of that. So ANHD, I didn't really explain who we are, but we're a non-for-profit group here in New York City that is almost 50 years old and works at the intersection of housing justice as economic justice as racial justice, and serves more than 80 plus neighborhood-based non-for-profits across New York City's neighborhoods. And we do policy and data analysis and organizing and advocacy and capacity building. And one of the things that we did quickly in the midst of COVID, and actually one of the first to do this analysis specifically in New York City, is because of our already existing understanding of neighborhoods and neighborhood level data. We're able to combine, and I think this speaks to some of what Kriston I think brought up, was combining where the data of where our essential workers are, where the heaviest impacts for COVID were, where our residents who are rent burdened, so those people who are paying more than a 30% threshold of their household income to rent, and where our POC communities are. And it very clearly showed that those things ended up all in the same place, right? We have a confluence of those various different factors, and that speaks to so many of the different institutional policies and systems that are in place, where we end up concentrating those same sets of residents and communities in the same geographic area. One way that also we've got to really think about how this shows up is in the desire and the need to get resources out quickly, that we don't recreate the existing systems and framework of excluding people of color, of women, of other marginalized communities that tend to often be left out of policies. So actually today, ANHG just did a quick, analysis and did an infographic looking at New York City is slated to get 20% of our emergency rent relief that just got passed in December as part of the COVID package. That's because the analysis was done based on New York City's share of the state population. However, New York City is 68% of the state's renters. We're overwhelmingly a renter city, and that number is only further exacerbated when we look at our people of color. We're 75% and plus of our people of color renters in the state. And so by New York City not getting its fair share of the state allocation of this money, we are adversely and disproportionately not serving New York City's renters, and we're also specifically not serving our POC renters in the city and the state. And these are the ways that we continue to manifest the same disparities and the same issues that we've continued to have and have plagued our policies for generations.
Thank you. Anyone else want to tackle any of the existing questions?
I'll just kind of jump in really quickly on a project that we recently did that kind of tackles both. I mean, like kind of bridges both, like kind of COVID crisis policy response and narrative shift. We worked closely with community organizers at Make the Road, because we love them and we do a lot of stuff with them, at the kind of the apex of the COVID crisis, at least early on here in the city in kind of April and May, to survey immigrant folks in Corona, upstate New York, in Long Island, to get a sense at that point, the data that was coming out, there wasn't a ton of kind of race and ethnicity specific data coming out. And organizers on the ground were seeing the impacts of the crisis on all these various levels. And that just wasn't part of the narrative, frankly, about kind of the pandemic. And so, we worked with organizers to kind of develop a survey tool that then they kind of, not in like your typical survey fashion, we're just like kind of extracting data from folks, but really working together with the folks that were being surveyed to both gather data, but also connect them to resources and connect them to ongoing advocacy opportunities. And what we found was that not only were kind of immigrant, especially undocumented immigrant communities, suffering at rates that were significantly higher than other communities throughout the city, especially white communities, but that also the impacts were multi-layered, that there were health impacts, economic impacts, education impacts, and then mental health impacts, overwhelming mental health impacts. And then we took kind of all of that data to then fuel kind of organizing advocacy efforts for kind of just recovery policies. But I think that kind of shift of like, really ensuring that it's folks from communities who are not only kind of reporting on what's happening, but also mobilizing to really call for change is an essential part of the kind of policy transformation that I think Barika is talking about, that we're kind of talking about in general tonight.
Can I jump in with just one more trend to look out for? And that's the role of jobs that may not return in sectors that, are disproportionately held by women and people of color more broadly. And these are some of the, lower to moderate and even mid-skilled jobs that are being increasingly automated. And so what will these workers do in the years ahead if their jobs don't come back? For so many restaurants and small businesses have closed. In grocery stores, we're being pushed to apps and delivery. And some of these jobs are even less secure than the previous jobs that people had. So I just think that's another really big picture issue that we should be prepared to deal with, because I think it will disproportionately impact both women of color and people of color more broadly.
We have a question, and I'm sure many people do now that we've, one day out of the inauguration and a change of administration at the federal level. What are the federal policies? I think the question was, if you had Joe Biden's personal ear, what would be 3 policies that you would suggest that he could enact without Senate or congressional approval that could impact the racial wealth gap? Any ideas? What would you whisper in Joe's ear?
I'll start more broadly. Let's see. Well, I mean, first, again, we've got to get the pandemic under control, and we've got to spur economic recovery. And I know he's working on that, and some of that will take the House and Senate engaging, and he can't do it totally unilaterally. But I mean, that's the most immediate crisis right now, right? Is getting people back to work so they can pay their rent, and getting kids back in school, and obviously preventing, hundreds of thousands of additional deaths in the months ahead. But I think we do have to look at access to education, access to worker training. I think these are really important. I do think, I don't know if it's in the top 3, but I do think that looking at, things like reparations and studying that and understanding what that could look like. Policies like baby bonds, Cory Booker's talked a lot about that. I mean, those are examples of some of the much more bold and systemic changes that, and that will be needed. But then we also do have to look at so many policies. I don't think we can just silo it to, if you have a wealth tax, then this will all be solved. Or if you just put more money toward education, it will all be solved. It's a constellation of different policies, both near term, long term, structural, and across a range of areas. So I know that wasn't 3 concise policies, but it's a huge issue that's occurred over centuries. And so there's just going to be a lot that needs to go into solving it from a public policy perspective if we're serious about truly eradicating it. And also, finally, the intersection of gender, because you can't address, it's tough to address the racial wealth gap or the gender wealth gap without really being serious about the intersectionality of the two.
Thanks, Kriston. And Walis, maybe, in the final minutes, I'll bring you back into the conversation. We've been talking a lot of data and a lot of policy, but we're here about the intersection of culture and policy. So I wanted to know, based on, the experiences you've had with this project, what's in the works for you in terms of future projects that you're thinking about or in the process of?
Okay, I'm not muted. Yeah, this project has taken on a life of its own, but it's also something that has been iterative. So one thing has led to the next thing, has led to the next thing. So I'm hoping that the next project will be less about sort of the destructive aspects of racism and structural racism, and more about the experience of Black joy and community and freedom. And because I think, those are things that not only I'm interested in focusing on, but I think those things exist even within this framework that we're talking about of the destructive and vicious aspects of racism and racial capitalism. So I want to try to reimagine, what that looks like, and also remember what that looks like in terms of, the communities that have experienced these, some of these terrible things.
Well, on a note of hope, I know we're a little past time, but if folks want to close with, what are the hopes? What are the hopeful things that you see in your field in terms of, long-wished policies, or, even just how advances that we've made on how issues get talked about now that seem more hopeful? Or more precise, in the broader culture. So I'll let everyone have a last word on that before I turn it back over to Solana. So anyone want to talk about what are they most hopeful about in how the work has changed?
I can talk about that just quickly, just to say, what this project what I hope for most is that people stop blaming themselves for the way that the society has failed them. I think that this whole bootstrap myth, you pull yourself up from your bootstraps and this will solve all your problems. I think that all of the data here and what people are talking about really is a testament to the fact that that is not true. and that we have to remember that and stop, especially Black people, stop blaming ourselves for things that are really out of our control.
Thank you. Anyone else? Barika?
I think I'm hopeful in this moment of feeling like we're as maybe not entirely as a nation, but a larger share of the country and even the world is really starting to understand, appreciate, and respect the role of organizing and power building in changing our communities and society. ANHD and our members have been organizing for 50 years. This is how we movement build. This is how we impact and really change and make transformational and lasting change. And it's iterative. We continue to do this. But I think for many years and many decades, we've struggled with the fact that it is often dismissed and not respected and silenced by so many different entities, be it government, philanthropy, writing. And I think there's really a confluence and understanding of the role that organizing and power building plays in changing the world. And I think also to bring in some of what Walis said, also understanding how art and culture is a part of that, and that they're not separate and different, and they always have been. And storytelling and music and expression have always been a part of how Black people have conveyed their struggle. And I think that there's really a bringing together of that's happened in the community for generations that is now really starting to be recognized and respected outside and in the broader discourse.
Thank you. Kriston or Betsy, any last hopeful words before we conclude the panel?
I'll just go quickly. Amanda Gorman, the poet laureate, gave me a whole lot of hope yesterday. That was really remarkable. I think also just in general, this kind of opening up kind of in popular culture of like, let's really ask the big questions. Let's like kind of radically rethink this stuff so that we're not just kind of tinkering around the edges, but kind of blow out the doors of possibility of what's possible, what's transformative. I feel like we're seeing that in kind of fits and starts ever since the Black Lives Matter movement and uprisings last spring. So that gives me a lot of hope.
And I'll just end by saying, being in Washington, I'm just so hopeful about the new administration and the end to the dark chapter that our nation experienced for the last 4 years, and that we can now move faster and quicker, and we can end, like the horrible situation we had last year where Congress was unable to move and, pass a stimulus bill and provide relief for people. So I hope those days are coming to an end. And I just am really optimistic that we can start to achieve things for Americans again. So.
Well, thank you all for being open, for, being pushed for pie in the sky policy suggestions today, and for giving us hope and data and community organizing and all the labor that has gone into the change that we're starting to see, and hopefully is just the beginning. So thank you all, and I'd like to pass it over to Solana for some concluding remarks.
I just am speechless. Thank you to all of you for your amazing, rich, deep, personal, and informative conversation, but also for all the work that you do every day. Thank you, Zenzele at Weeksville, for your partnership. Thank you, Prerana, for moderating this really tough conversation. We have 4 amazing ladies here, and there was so much to say, so thank you. I want to thank our Civic programs team, our IT team, our marketing and development, our VX team that does such an amazing job in person. I want to thank again Ford Foundation and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs for their generous support, both the commission and of the programs, Howard Gilman for providing the Zoom, our curatorial team for having curated such an amazing exhibition. And if it's safe for you to do so, we want to invite you once more to attend Howardena Pindell Rope, Fire, Water in person at the Shed. It's open until spring 2021. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight. We know we went a little past, but we thought the conversation was worth it. Thank you, and keep coming back for the next couple of conversations. There's much more ahead. So have a good night.